The Haunting Survival of Alexander Pearce, The Escape from Van Diemen's Land. It all began in 1822 on the remote, cruel island of Van Diemen's Land, present-day Tasmania, a place of death, isolation, and terror where the land itself seemed to be in league with the hellish punishments of the British penal system. Alexander Pearce, a young man of no great importance, had found himself shackled and condemned to this desolate place for the most grievous of crimes. The crime that led him to the penal colony was a petty theft. Yet, to the British Empire, this transgression made him a hardened criminal deserving of extreme punishment. As Pearce was shoved into the grim conditions of the prison, the island immediately seemed to consume him. It wasn't just the constant surveillance or the backbreaking labor under the guard of cruel men. It was the island itself that seemed to whisper to him, as if it could feel his every breath, his every thought. The dense, suffocating forests and the relentless, howling winds, strangely comforting in their own eerie way, left him with a peculiar feeling that the land had a secret. It was as if the trees themselves were alive, waiting, watching. One fateful day, Pearce, along with several other convicts, was given the task of laboring in a distant and nearly unreachable part of the island. But there was a catch. Pearce and his fellow men were already on their last tether. The guards had become aware of the men's brewing desperation, their collective yearning for freedom. And as if they knew what would happen, they had sent Pearce on what was meant to be a one-way journey, a journey to break him. But instead, it was the very thing that ignited something else in him. The storm had come in a heartbeat, violent, sudden, and without warning. As the rain began to pour in torrents, Pearce saw his chance. His fellow convicts, desperate, feverish with the thought of escape, broke free. The guards, caught off guard in the storm, had no chance to stop them. What followed was an audacious dash into the heart of the wilderness. As Pearce and the others ran, the sense of impending doom seemed to follow them. With each step, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier. The deeper they went, the more they realized they weren't alone. Something moved in the shadows, something that made no sound, but seemed to breathe the same thick, suffocating air that they did. A whisper in the trees, a flicker in the periphery of their vision, a presence that was impossible to ignore. Days turned to weeks. Their provisions had long run out, and the once green wilderness seemed to shift, grow darker. The escape was no longer a flight for freedom, but an agonizing test of survival. The forest seemed to shift, becoming more hostile with every passing hour. Supplies were exhausted. The men, gaunt and wild-eyed, could no longer tell hunger from hallucination. Desperation set in. One by one, the convicts fell to the twisted landscape, their bodies breaking, their minds fractured. But Pearce, he was different. As his companions succumbed to madness, something in him sharpened. In the wilderness, he had no choice but to face his deepest fears, and he would learn that the true horror was not the storm, nor the island, but the darkness that resided within himself. Pearce was the last man standing. The other survivors, starved, broken, and undone by the island, had been consumed by their own madness. He had no other choice. In a state of utter insanity, driven by the animalistic instinct to survive, Pearce did the unthinkable. He resorted to cannibalism. His companions, once men he had shared fleeting words with, had become nothing more than meat for survival. The guilt, the madness, the horror, it clawed at him. Yet, somehow, it kept him alive. Each day, the forest grew quieter as he trudged on, driven by nothing more than the need to escape and the gnawing hunger in his belly. But escape seemed impossible. Pearce wandered for what felt like eternity, until one day, when the last remnants of his sanity were slipping away, he stumbled upon the edge of the forest. He had reached the shores of the island. It was the coast that did not save him. Number. The island itself had turned its back on him, as if it were willing to sacrifice him too. In his mind, the fog, the sea, the relentless wind were all mocking him. He could almost hear their taunts. His escape now was a bitter irony. But just as he stood at the edge of the world, a ship appeared on the horizon. A rescue, perhaps. Number A rescue wasn't the salvation he thought it would be. What he didn't know was that this would be his final test. He was a broken man, trapped between two worlds, the savage island and the unforgiving civilization that would never forgive him for what he had done. The ship had no mercy for him. And in that moment, he knew that the true horror wasn't the island. It was the lingering truth, an undeniable certainty that he was now forever a part of the island's darkness. The terrifying survival of the Uruguayan Rugby Team, the Andes Miracle. In 1972, the world was not yet ready for the chilling survival story that would later be known as the Miracle in the Andes. It all began with a group of young men, rugby players, traveling from Uruguay to Chile for an international match. What was meant to be an exhilarating adventure, a celebration of sport and camaraderie, quickly transformed into a nightmare beyond imagination. But what followed would be a story of survival so horrific, so dark, it could scarcely be believed. The ill-fated flight, which took place on October 13th, was a commercial flight aboard a Fairchild FH-227D. The plane was carrying 45 people, rugby players, their friends, and family. It was supposed to be a routine flight, a short hop through the Andes Mountains. But in the blink of an eye, everything changed. A thick cloud cover enveloped the aircraft as it tried to navigate through the jagged peaks of the Andes. The pilots, disoriented and confused, failed to properly read their navigation equipment. The clouds made visibility near zero, and before anyone could comprehend the danger, the plane collided with the mountainside. The deafening roar of the crash ripped through the air, and for a few moments there was nothing but the sickening noise of metal being torn apart. When the survivors awoke, they were scattered across the wreckage of the plane. The once bright and lively passengers were now broken, bloodied, and battered. Some were dead on impact, while others, like the players, found themselves in a living hell. The freezing cold of the Andes, the biting wind, and the altitude made it impossible to think clearly. The reality of the situation was crushing. Help would not come quickly. No one knew where they were, and the terrain was unforgiving. But the survivors' worst nightmare had only just begun. As they came to grips with their surroundings, their hopes began to fade. Rescue attempts were futile. Days passed, and there was no sign of help. The survivors faced unrelenting cold, pain, and shock. Even worse, they were trapped on the mountain, cut off from civilization by miles of snow, ice, and desolate peaks. The group quickly realized that their only hope was to wait for help to arrive. But time moved differently in the frozen abyss of the Andes. Every moment was a battle for survival, and every hour brought a new challenge. The passengers had only the wreckage for shelter, and with no food, no supplies, they knew that without a miracle, they would not make it through the night. Days turned to weeks. On the fourth day, a dreadful realization set in desperation began to twist the air, a quiet horror that took hold of each man's mind. There was no food. The frozen wilderness gave nothing, offered no mercy. The survivors had no choice but to begin to eat whatever they could find. But that wasn't enough. The survivors had to come to terms with a terrifying, unspeakable decision. To survive, they would have to turn to the bodies of their fallen friends and teammates. It was an act that none could have anticipated, yet it became their only means of survival. The realization that they were driven to cannibalism tore at the fabric of their humanity. The survivors were no longer just fighting the mountain, the cold, or the weather. They were fighting the darkness within themselves, and the horror of that truth lingered with every bite, every choice made to stay alive. As the days bled into weeks, the survivors grew weaker. their bodies gaunt, their minds frayed. But the true horror wasn't in the slow, gnawing hunger or in the blizzards that seemed to rage endlessly. It was in the tension that grew between them, in the desperate madness that began to seep into every moment. They could hear the groans of the dying in the stillness, could feel the pull of their conscience snapping at them. They were alone in the world, alone with nothing but the mountains and the memories of their lost loved ones. And then, in the midst of their despair, a glimmer of hope came. After nearly 2 weeks, 2 of the survivors, Roberto Canessa and Fernando Parado, managed to gather enough strength to attempt a desperate trek for help. Their plan was simple, if impossible, to find a way off the mountain and get to civilization, to search for any sign of rescue. The journey was one of sheer will, the kind of determination that goes beyond survival. It becomes a primal instinct, a fight against everything that is beyond the physical. The 2 men navigated the towering peaks, battling the elements, the hunger, and the constant weight of despair. For over 10 days, they fought through snow, ice, and dangerous terrain. Every step was agony, every moment a test of their sanity. And yet, they pressed on, as if something beyond them, something greater, was driving them forward. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, the men encountered a small group of shepherds on the other side of the mountain. The sight of human life, after so many days, seemed almost unreal. Canessa and Parado, emaciated, covered in cuts and bruises, barely able to speak, pleaded for help. It was a miracle that they were alive, and the shepherds, after some disbelief, managed to get the survivors off the mountain and to safety. But the horror was far from over. By the time help arrived and the survivors were rescued, only 16 men had made it out of the Andes alive. The rest, victims of hunger, the elements, or their own desperation, were left behind. The survivors were haunted by the faces of the men they had lost, and even more so by the fact that some of those men had been the very ones whose bodies they had consumed to stay alive. The psychological toll was immense. Their minds were scarred, their spirits forever broken. They had survived the Andes, yes, but they had also crossed a line from which they could never return. Their bodies were saved, but a part of their souls would forever remain trapped in that desolate, snow-covered hell. The story of the survivors of the Andes would go on to shock the world. It became a symbol of human endurance, but also of the darkness that can arise in the face of survival. Even after they were rescued, the men found themselves in an ongoing battle, not against the mountains, but against their own guilt and the haunting memories of what they had done to stay alive. The disastrous survival of Joe Simpson and Simon Yates. The perils of Mount Siula Grande. The Andes Mountains had claimed many lives before. Some climbers sought to conquer the peaks. Others, like Joe Simpson and Simon Yates, were only looking for the glory of surviving in the harshest conditions. But there are moments in the pursuit of adventure where the mountain doesn't just challenge you, it breaks you. It pushes you past your limits until you don't know where survival ends and madness begins. This is the story of 2 climbers who learned that survival doesn't always come with a happy ending. It was the summer of 1985, and Joe Simpson and Simon Yates, both experienced climbers, had set out to scale the treacherous peak of Mount Siula Grande in the Peruvian Andes. The mountain, standing at 6,344 meters, was notoriously difficult to climb, with jagged ridges, ice fields, and shifting winds that could tear apart even the most prepared climber. Despite the danger, Joe and Simon were filled with optimism, their bond of friendship and shared ambition strong enough to drive them toward the summit. But even before they began the climb, a sense of unease had settled in. The weather was unpredictable. Dark clouds gathered ominously over the mountain, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the jagged landscape. The chill in the air was sharp and unforgiving, It felt as if the mountain itself was aware of their presence, watching, waiting. The first few days of the climb were grueling but uneventful. They ascended cautiously, setting up camp at night and pushing themselves forward by day. Their progress was slow but steady. They found their rhythm, relying on each other's strength. The mountain, however, had other plans. On the third day, the weather took a turn for the worse. A heavy snowstorm swept in, coating the mountain in a thick blanket of snow. The visibility dropped to near zero. Joe and Simon found themselves struggling to find their bearings, lost in a maze of frozen rock and ice. Their plans to reach the summit were slowly slipping away, but they pressed on, determined to finish what they had started. Then came the turning point, the moment when everything went wrong. On their descent, Joe Simpson slipped. His foot caught on a ledge, and he tumbled down the icy slope, his body twisting uncontrollably in the air. When he finally came to a stop, the pain was indescribable. He had shattered his right leg, the bone jutting grotesquely from his skin. He could no longer stand, let alone climb. Simon, hearing Joe's screams, scrambled to his side. He found his friend lying motionless, blood staining the snow beneath him. The shock of seeing Joe in such a terrible state was almost too much to bear. But Simon was a seasoned climber. He knew what he had to do. He fashioned a makeshift splint and attempted to help Joe as best he could. But the mountain was indifferent to their plight. They were trapped, stranded in the middle of a frozen hell. Simon had no choice but to attempt the impossible, to lower Joe down the mountain, one rope at a time, inch by painful inch. The task was monumental. The cold, the snow, and the harsh terrain conspired against them. Joe, in his agony, tried to endure, but each movement was excruciating. The pain was too much. His leg throbbed relentlessly, and the physical strain of being lowered in such a manner seemed to tear at his will to survive. But the true horror of the situation wasn't just the unbearable pain Joe was in, it was what Simon was forced to do in order to save himself. As they descended, the weather grew worse. The wind howled in their ears, and the snow fell faster than they could climb. Simon's strength was waning. The ropes were beginning to freeze in the icy conditions. They were stuck, unable to move forward or back. Joe's condition worsened by the hour, and Simon realized that their only hope of survival was to reach a lower point on the mountain, a place of relative safety. As the hours turned into a terrifying wait, Simon realized that the decision he had been dreading had come. His body was exhausted. Joe's condition was beyond his ability to treat. The mountains seemed to mock him, an immovable force that pressed down on their already fragile minds. In the chaos of the storm, Simon found himself holding the rope between Joe's life and his own. He had no choice. Simon was forced to cut the rope that tethered him to his injured friend. The act itself was a gut-wrenching horror. It was an impossible choice: to sever the only thing that held Joe to life, to condemn him to the abyss, or to save himself. Simon in that moment had no illusions of escaping the mountain, but the cold, brutal reality of survival forced him to make the ultimate sacrifice. He cut the rope. Joe fell. But the fall didn't kill him. What followed was an incomprehensible horror that no one could have predicted. Simon, alone now in the heart of the storm, descended further into the snow, knowing full well that the odds of survival for Joe were slim. But what he didn't know was that Joe wasn't dead. Somehow, impossibly, Joe survived the fall. Broken, barely conscious, and with his leg in pieces, he crawled through the snow and ice, driven by sheer force of will, seeking any form of shelter. The wilderness seemed to mock his suffering, yet Joe kept moving, his body fighting against its own collapse. But the horrors didn't end there. Joe was not only battling the weather and his injuries, he was now lost in a frozen labyrinth, crawling through the nightmarish terrain with nothing but a slim hope of finding Simon again. His body was breaking down, yet his mind refused to succumb. Days passed. Joe's strength slowly ebbed away, but his heart still beat, still pushed him forward. When Joe finally reached a rescue party, his body was unrecognizable. He was covered in frostbite, his leg mangled beyond repair. But he was alive. Simon, after having made his way to safety, had assumed Joe was dead. He had no idea that his friend was still out there, fighting to survive. And so, in the end, they both made it down the mountain, but only after enduring unspeakable terror, betrayal by nature itself, and a deep moral wound that neither could forget. Simon was forever haunted by the choice he made, and Joe was left with the scars, not only on his body, but deep within his psyche. The grisly survival of the Pendergrass family, stranded in the wilderness. In the spring of 2003, the Pendergrass family of 4, a father, mother, and their 2 young children, set off for what should have been a peaceful, idyllic weekend camping trip in the remote wilderness of the Utah desert. They were experienced outdoorsmen, well prepared for the challenges of the wild. Little did they know that this seemingly innocent excursion would lead them into a nightmare that would test every fiber of their being, dragging them into the darkest recesses of human survival instincts. It all began innocuously enough. The sun was shining, the air crisp with the scent of the desert, and the family set up camp beside a sparkling creek. The father, Mark Pendergrass, had taken special care in selecting the perfect spot, far from any human activity, nestled in a secluded valley, surrounded by rugged cliffs. They were excited to disconnect, to leave behind the noise of the world and spend time with one another. But the wilderness had other plans for them. After settling in, the family explored the area. The kids, 10-year-old Sarah and 8-year-old Ben, ran ahead, excitedly picking wildflowers, while Mark and his wife Rachel followed slowly, taking in the scenery. Hours passed, and as they returned to camp, the weather began to shift. The breeze turned cold, a chill sweeping across the valley. In the distance, dark clouds began to gather ominously. The air felt thick, heavy with the promise of something worse. By nightfall, the storm had fully arrived. What had started as a gentle breeze quickly escalated into a vicious gale, with winds howling and trees bending under the pressure. The rain came in sheets, and the temperature plummeted, turning their cozy campsite into a bitter, inhospitable place. Mark and Rachel attempted to secure their tent, but the storm had already begun to tear at it. By morning, the family had no choice but to abandon their camp and head back to the nearest road for shelter. But they didn't make it. The storm had grown so severe that they couldn't find their bearings. The creek they had followed now appeared to have disappeared, swallowed up by the rising floodwaters. The family walked for hours, but the terrain was treacherous. Mudslides, fallen trees, and swollen streams obstructed their path. The wilderness had closed in around them, and they couldn't see the way back. Panic began to rise, each family member's anxiety escalating as the landscape remained unfamiliar. The storm raged on, turning the wilderness into a chaotic blur of rain and fog. They could hear the roaring of the floodwaters, but the trees and rocks seemed to distort the sound, making it impossible to judge where the danger lay. The wilderness, once a place of beauty, now felt suffocating, oppressive. It wasn't long before their food and water supply dwindled, and soon they were lost, utterly, hopelessly lost. The true horror of their situation began to sink in when Mark and Rachel realized they had no way of navigating out. They had no map, no GPS, and their phones had no signal. In their panic, they had left behind the compass and survival gear they had initially packed in haste. It seemed as though they were being punished by the wilderness, slowly and mercilessly. Days passed. What had been an adventure had turned into a fight for survival. With no food, no way to find their way out, and no shelter, they were left to contend with the elements. The rain continued, and the floodwaters rose, leaving them soaked, cold, and starving. Every step was an agonizing struggle against exhaustion, hunger, and fear. The wilderness felt like a living, breathing thing, waiting, watching, to consume them. But it wasn't the storm or the hunger that brought them closest to death. It was something far darker. As the days wore on, Mark's optimism began to fade. The weight of their situation was crushing, and he began to slip into a state of utter despair. It was Rachel, ever the calm voice of reason, who kept them moving, urging Mark to continue, to hold on to hope. But the children, sweet, innocent children, knew the truth before their parents did. They had seen the looks in their eyes. They knew that their chances of survival were growing slimmer by the hour. And then, on the 5th day, the unthinkable happened. As they walked through a dense thicket of trees, they stumbled upon a pack of coyotes. The creatures, drawn by the smell of their desperation, began to circle. At first, the family tried to chase them away, but the animals were relentless. They were hungry, desperate, and there was no other food source for miles. The coyotes stalked them, silently, menacingly, keeping their distance, but never leaving them alone. The family's fear escalated. Now not only was the wilderness their enemy, but nature itself seemed to turn against them. In the midst of this terror, Mark made a fateful decision. They had to make it out. He would do anything to get his family to safety, even if it meant risking everything. He knew that if they didn't find shelter, the cold would claim them before the coyotes ever could. Mark, desperate and on the edge of collapse, ordered his family to head towards a cliffside, hoping that the higher ground would provide some sense of relief from the predators below. But the higher ground was not the safety they had hoped for. What they didn't know was that the cliff they were climbing was unstable. The sudden shift of the earth beneath them triggered a landslide, sending large boulders tumbling down the mountain. The family barely managed to escape the falling debris, but the fall left them separated. Mark and Rachel at the base of the cliff, while Sarah and Ben were left hanging onto the edge. Mark, in his desperation to save his children, reached out for them. He was inches away from pulling Sarah to safety when another boulder dislodged, causing the ground beneath him to give way. The horror of that moment was indescribable. One final gut-wrenching scream from his daughter as she fell into the abyss. Rachel, screaming, raced to her husband's side, but it was too late. The mountain had taken everything. Mark's grip failed. The family was fractured, with no one left to rely on but themselves. Rachel, now utterly alone, had only one thought: survival. With a broken heart and a shattered spirit, Rachel continued her journey with Ben. For 3 more days they fought through the wilderness, the emotional weight of their lost family members pressing down on them like an inescapable vice. Finally, Rachel and Ben stumbled upon a search party, a team of rescuers sent to find them. They were found on the brink of death, frozen, starving, and in total shock. But they were alive.